Hello, my name is Jonathan Lande. As you'll see, I'm an assistant professor of history at Purdue University. I just want to thank Mike and the Civil War Roundtable Congress for inviting me here to speak with you and to share my research. The research talk I have for you today is the Black Badge of Courage. As you'll notice, I have adapted it from a journal article that I published in the Journal of American Ethnic History. So while I'll provide most of the information, it is kind of shortened, and it doesn't, of course, have the footnotes. So if you'd like to look up further information, it's there. I also have provided my information, my website, as well as my email address. I'm always happy to respond to emails. I get plenty of them from my students. So it's always nice to have ones that are related to the Civil War rather than their grades or assignments that can get a little dogged. So what I'd like to do today is discuss with you the Black Badge of Courage. And you might be wondering, what is the Black Badge of Courage? How does it differentiate itself from the Red Badge of Courage, which of course we as Civil War wonks love to talk about, know quite well. Well, I'll begin with looking at this famous image and talking about Frederick Douglass's son, Lewis Douglass. And of course, this image, which you might be able to gather from the reflection in the background, is quite famous. It's been reproduced. I have the Gilder Lehrman version right there. This one that I have posted on the screen is from the Library of Congress. It is, of course, of the famed 54th Massachusetts, mounting Battery Wagner and attacking the Confederates entrenched there. And what's significant about this is, of course, that Black soldiers were able to demonstrate their valor and their courage. They had done so prior to this at Milliken's Bend, and then before that at Port Hudson. But of course, this was in the Eastern Theater, so it was all the more important. And after the battle, when Lewis Douglass had survived the fight, although many of his comrades had fallen, he wrote to his father. Now, his father, of course, being the famed Frederick Douglass, one of the most famous men in all of America, famed even in Europe for his abolitionism, his powerful speaking abilities, and having escaped slavery to fight so hard for the enslaved Americans that were still in captivity before the Civil War and during part of it. And Lewis wrote to his father, and he said this. He said, "Our men fought like tigers." He continued on in this letter following the battle to his mom and dad. "This performance on our part earned for us the reputation of a fighting regiment." He closed and he said, "If I die tonight, I will not die a coward." Now, this is significant because, of course, Black soldiers had been barred from serving in the war up to 1863. There were, of course, a few regiments serving in 1862, and these were experimental, but not until Abraham Lincoln proclaimed emancipation on January 1st, 1863, and opened up the U.S. Armed Forces to Black soldiers en masse did Black soldiers get a chance to prove themselves not to be cowards, which is what many white Americans thought Black Americans would be, which is in part why white Americans kept Black soldiers from fighting. Now, the letter is also significant because, of course, Frederick Douglass was an extraordinarily private man. For all his fame and all the laudits that he had earned, his family kept largely from the limelight. And he chose not to broadcast his dealings with his wife, keep his wife back home where she preferred to be, because so many, as historians including Lee Fout have shown, Frederick Douglass and many African Americans who had escaped from slavery wanted to protect the home space from the prying eyes, because during slavery they had not been able to. Yet Frederick Douglass and his wife chose to print this letter. They put it in the Douglass Monthly 2 months after the Battery Wagner onslaught. And they published it in part because Frederick Douglass knew that this letter wasn't private business. His son's valor and his son's proof of bravery were evidence that Black soldiers could succeed on the battlefield, that they were not cowards, and that their sacrifice would mean ultimately, or they hoped it would mean, that Black soldiers and other Black men would be given the right to vote, would be given access to public participation. Now, ultimately, this succeeded. As we all know, in the famed film Glory, Black soldiers were able to succeed, and this helped earn them a spot at the table, as it were, with the 14th and 15th Amendments. But this was not assured. Part of the reason that Black soldiers were not remembered and that this letter was published was because Black soldiers had been largely forgotten by white Americans before the Civil War. Black Americans had been fighting in the American Revolution. They had fought in the War of 1812. They had been proven as valorous as white soldiers. They had laudits provided to them from not only George Washington, but also Andrew Jackson, both slaveholders. But many Americans had forgot about Black courage. And this became the impetus to rewrite the story and provide a new history. And so what I hope to show for you today is how three Black historians forged what I call the Black Badge of Courage. We'll examine William Cooper Nell, William Wells Brown, and Francis Roland, three very distinct individuals, but all fighting for a similar cause. We'll look at how this Black Badge of Courage was a textual account distinct from commemorations provided in public or provided in speeches at the time. We'll see that this is a commemoration of Black soldiers' sacrifice, and it was a tool meant to do three things: demand recognition for African Americans as Americans, to demonstrate suitability for inclusion, citizenship, and suffrage, and to ultimately undermine racism as it reared its head in the post-war period. I'll do this for you today, looking at first the pre-war politics, then looking at the Civil War, and finally at the Recollections. So to begin, we start the story off of the Black Badge of Courage with African Americans' interest in the written word. Now, shortly after the American Revolution, there had been a number of emancipations across the North and even some in the South. Those states in the North were doing it, whereas individual enslavers were doing it throughout the South. Now, as they did so, as these white Americans freed enslaved Americans, they still marginalized African Americans, and you saw the re-entrenchment of racial hierarchies and the establishment of new racisms. And in order to confront these things, African Americans turned to the written word as a means of combating marginalization. Now, for instance, as Thomas Jefferson is articulating in the Notes on the State of Virginia, although he wrote in the Declaration of Independence about the equality of all, that African Americans and people of African descent generally were unequal, you had the genius of Phyllis Wheatley in her book of poetry. You also had by 1827, African Americans starting to engage in one of the most important, if not the most important, political technology of the era, which is, of course, the newspaper. In 1827, Samuel Cornish and John Worsfold began the first Black newspaper, Freedom's Journal. I have a short, small quotation of that right here, and you'll see that they sought to plead their own cause. Now, they meant by this that they were going to try to fight and demonstrate their heroics, their contributions to the nation, the fact that they were as American as any other white American. Now, they wanted to contribute to two primary political movements of the era. They first wanted to contribute to nationalism, and they wanted to contribute by writing specifically historical accounts of their contributions to the nation. So African Americans' nationalism developed in the 1820s and 1830s. It really grew and expanded into the 1840s, 50s, until it hit the high point, I believe, in the 19th century with the American Civil War. The reason that African Americans needed to demonstrate their nationalism, prove that they were American, was because there was concerted efforts by many white Americans to demonstrate that Africans, peoples of African descent, and what we now call African Americans, were distinct from white Americans and should be excluded. Now, one of the most popular spaces for this was in meetings of the American Colonization Society, or the ACS. The ACS, if you're not aware, was a colonization organization that believed that Africans should be removed from the United States. This is an organization that included prominent members of political parties, including Henry Clay. Of course, Abraham Lincoln had ascribed to colonization before he adopted more integrated approaches to the American polity, but it also included others you might not expect, including William Lloyd Garrison. So it was a widespread movement in the early 19th century, and one of the most important events for establishing who was American, and one that the American Colonization Society took note of course, on July 4th. Now, as many scholars have shown, July 4th, much as we know today, is a moment to say, this is what constitutes America. This is who we are. The 19th century, it was arguably even more important, rather than a festive day for parades where you would gather candy in the streets like we do today. It was a moment to demonstrate in public fashion who was included in the Republic and what exactly constituted the Republic. Now, the American Colonization Society used this day to say that white Americans were true Americans, whereas no other Americans, marginalized or other, were not Americans. And as you can see here, a Freedom's Journal correspondent wrote that nothing serves more to keep us in our present degraded state than the revolting pictures which are drawn by American colonization orders on the 4th of July and other public occasions. So you see here African Americans recognizing that their exclusion occurred in public each and every day, but especially on 4th of July and other public occasions when Americans were discussing who was American and what constituted America. So African Americans in this space decided to respond. They chose to engage. While some African Americans chose to separate themselves from American nationalism, they chose to isolate themselves, articulate themselves as being distinct, even more distinct than was articulated by white Americans. There were many who chose to embrace the 4th of July, and they chose to re-articulate the nation as being both inclusive and anti-slavery. And the most effective date for many of these African Americans, they believed, was 4th of July. And they made speeches, they joined parades. You'll see here from William Wells Brown, who's pictured here, a quotation where he describes, "When the people are thinking and talking about liberty is the most appropriate time to bring up the question of slavery, when the people are looking back to the time when the great struggle for American liberty was about to be fought, is the time to make an impression." So in other words, when everybody's thinking about what America is, what happened at a nation's birth, is the perfect time for African Americans to articulate that America, while there is this strain of racist America that white Americans like the American Colonization Society are articulating, there's also this other vision of the nation. And this vision is a vision of an inclusive nation that includes all people who are participating and is anti-slavery rather than pro-slavery. So this is one major strain that contributes to the development of the Black Badge of Courage in the pre-war period. The other major element is history. And in the early 19th century, you had a real transformation of what constituted American history, of course, as it is being written for the first time, and then how history is written, what it means to write history. Because, of course, writing history and the histories that we write is a political act. And what happened around 1830, right as the American colonization is revving up, is you have Americans starting to really think deeply about what it means to be an American by reflecting on their past. And in particular, they have a strong reverence for the American Revolution. They're meditating increasingly on death, and they are paying close attention to the war heroes who passed during the American Revolution. These Americans are being honored in cemeteries, they're being honored in poems, and they're being honored in histories, almost in a Homeric fashion. Yet, of course, most cemeteries were segregated. So only white affluent men were receiving spaces in these prominent cemeteries across the country, and white poets and historians are lauding white war heroes. They're, of course, lauding George Washington. They're talking increasingly about, after the War of 1812, patriots like Andrew Jackson, but they are not speaking of people like Crispus Attucks or Peter Salem, and those who contributed to the defense of New Orleans. So, as they're doing so, as these white historians are writing, enters in one of the great historians of the 19th century, if not the greatest historian of the 19th century, in terms of his prominence and contributions to the development of American history, George Bancroft. You see here, these deep chops cutting into his cheek. So George Bancroft developed his historical style going to the vanguard of historical professional scholarship in Germany. He used advanced historical methods. He was really developing history when academic history was in its infancy. This is no longer necessarily the space for solely people who are interested in the past for the sake of being interested in the past, or are writing for the courts, writing for monarchs. Now they're increasingly writing in the age of nationalism to speak about what constitutes the spaces that they live in and what constitutes a specific person. So increasingly, you have this development of an academic form of historical scholarship. But they also did not have the same inclination to avoid bias. They did not have the inclination to add everything in, even the things that might add a blemish to your narrative. So in this romantic age, they omitted information to suit a narrative. And George Bancroft, especially in his multi-volume History of the United States, first published the first volume in 1828, he was meant to show that democracy in America was emerging in the wilderness. He showed a development of this democracy and white Americans' contributions to it. And he omitted important information. For instance, when writing to his English editor, he said, as you see here, the warts on Franklin's face I wish omitted. He also selected who exactly constituted American. So just as on the July 4th holiday, in these histories, George Bancroft excluded African Americans. Now, African Americans were not going to take this. They believed deeply that they were American. And so they joined the movement of developing a history as well. So they responded to the absences and disparagements, and they wrote redeeming accounts of the past to reimagine a nation by rewriting that past. So by including their participation in the American Revolution, in the War of 1812, they could show that they were just as American as everybody else. And at the forefront of this movement was William Cooper Nell. Now, William Cooper Nell was born in 1817 in Boston. He was a copyist, but he really made a name for himself as the historian of the abolitionist movement, and his contributions to publications including The Liberator. Now, William Cooper Nell didn't really have his space, if you will, within the abolitionist movement until the 1840s. And that's when abolitionist John Greenleaf Whittier wrote in the National Era that the colored soldiers of the Revolution have had no historian. So William Cooper Nell, reading of this, begins to really ponder and think about how he might contribute to the abolitionist movement in his own way. And in May 1848, he writes for Frederick Douglass, the abolitionist newspaper, the North Star. And he decided that he was going to reintroduce the nation to the first martyr of the American Revolution, who we all know now is Crispus Attucks. But many white Americans at the moment had long forgotten Crispus Attucks. So Nell decided that he was going to demonstrate and use the moment of the American Revolution to prove that Attucks and other bygone soldiers were loyal patriots of the nation. As you see here, Nell wrote, the loyalty of colored soldiers is of at least significance enough to claim for their descendants treatment equal to those of a paler hue. So you see in this language how William Cooper Nell is envisioning as early as 1848 the need to rewrite African Americans' part in the nation by using history itself, and in particular, using the American Revolution and Crispus Attucks' story to contribute. Now, it was important for Nell to contribute war stories, but why? Well, he articulated clearly in his introduction to his first monograph in 1855, The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution, exactly why. So in this, he commented that military services are generally conceded as passports to the honorable and lasting notice of Americans. Now, he noted also at this point that he could have spoken on doctors, he could have spoken on newspaper journalists, he could have cited any number of Americans, African Americans, fulfilling any number of important political and professional positions in order to contribute to their nation. But he saw, as he states here, military service as being crucial. Now, this brought together that movement in the early 1830s to give reverence to war heroes by white Americans. Now, William Cooper Nell wanted to do this for African Americans specifically. So he began to recount the stories of the American Revolution with Black soldiers and martyrs at the center of it. And you see here from his 1855 history, two images that clearly place Black Americans at the center of great events during the American Revolution. You have here Crispus Attucks dying at the Boston Revolution, or the Boston Massacre, and you have Peter Salem here at Bunker Hill. Now, these became important nodes in the abolitionist movement. African Americans began to increasingly see military service, therefore, as a means of liberation. And this was reflected nowhere more than in Massachusetts, where the abolitionist movement was arguably the most potent and strong, with African Americans seeking to join the Massachusetts militia, which barred Black men from joining. And they gave particular reverence to warriors as articulated in Nell's work. And this was, of course, on the brink of the Civil War. Now, Black leaders embraced military service, and none embraced it more than Frederick Douglass. Now, the outbreak of the Civil War, I don't think here in this forum I need to get too deeply into. But of course, when the war broke out, African Americans were barred from military service. While the South wanted to preserve or establish its Confederate States of America with slavery at the heart of it, and the North wanted to preserve the Union and protect it from the slaverocrats who sought to erode the Union that they thought so deeply of. African Americans, especially those in the North, saw this as an opportunity not only to strike for their freedom, but to strike at racism and to make room for themselves within the polity. They saw in particular, because of the war stories, because of the emphasis on nationalism that had been so prominent in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, that citizenship could be established through military service and the application of their military service through an establishment of their manhood. So you had, by 1863, the Weekly Anglo-African, the prominent New York Black newspaper, saying, "Will you vindicate your manhood?" as it called on African Americans to participate. And once Abraham Lincoln was finally able to open the door to African Americans, you had Frederick Douglass advocating for participation in articulating clearly, as you see here in this quotation, to fight for the government in this tremendous war is to fight for nationality and for a place with all classes of our fellow citizens. You see here in a recruiting poster the significance of military service to Black soldiers. And this all builds on those histories that William Cooper Nell had written. It builds on those celebrations of July 4th that William Wells Brown had participated in, as well as other Black leaders like Sojourner Truth. So as William Lloyd Garrison is, of course, burning the Declaration of Independence and calling it a covenant with the devil, you have some African Americans pushing for a re-envisionment of the nation on July 4th. And this really comes all together during the American Civil War, and Frederick Douglass advocates for it. But of course, not all African Americans are engaged with this project. They remember the past. They also recognize that once Abraham Lincoln opens up the door to Black enlistment, that the treatment within the Army is not going to be what it was. So you have many African American detractors citing, of course, lower pay. You have them citing previous treatment, including the forgetful memories of white Americans who had, of course, no longer remembered Crispus Attucks or Peter Salem. You have low bounties compared to white soldiers, and you have leaders who had once advocated for an anti-slavery free nation like William Wells Brown, thinking that the nation, that African Americans didn't need to contribute to the nation, that they were probably better off not participating, not putting their lives on the line. Now, William Wells Brown, in his development of his historical narrative, is crucial to appreciating how the Civil War transforms patriotism and brings it to the center so that this black badge of courage is reestablished. William Wells Brown was born in 1815, enslaved. He lived in Missouri. He escaped slavery, and he became an outspoken abolitionist, as you saw earlier. Part of his abolitionism was to contribute to 4th of July celebrations. He also, like Frederick Douglass, contributed with the written word. He first wrote his autobiography, which you see here, the narrative of William Wells Brown, an American slave. He also wrote the Clotel of the President's Daughter, which was a version of the story of Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And this text is important because it shows William Wells Brown grappling with what it exactly means to be an American. So as I said earlier, of course, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence and is held out as being a foremost patriot among white Americans. But he was also, of course, a slaveholder. He was had an enslaved peoples on his property throughout his life. And while he spoke against it, he also, of course, claimed that slavery was like holding a wolf by the ears. You didn't want to let go, but you didn't like what you were holding on to. For Brown, Clotel was an example of this. Now, this is a story that reimagines the precarious relationship, relationship that's inspired so many different stories and histories since Thomas Jefferson's day all the way to ours, which is the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And this precarious relationship for Brown really symbolized America's great hypocrisy. The fact that those who speak of freedom also are deeply entrenched and engaged in perpetuating bondage and anti-Black racism. So as William Wells Brown moves through his life as an abolitionist, really questioning what American nationalism is, contributing to a reestablishment of American nationalism as something that is both anti-racist and anti-slavery, he ultimately, by the time of the war, is in disagreement with Black leaders like Frederick Douglass, who believe that patriotism could contribute to the inclusion of African Americans. By the Civil War, William Wells Brown is advocating from emigration from the United States. He's saying that Black Americans are better off if they leave the nation. He opposed military service in particular. There was a famous scene which is recounted in Ezra Greenspan's recent, well-written biography of William Wells Brown, where he's at a celebration and he recalls at this abolitionist celebration how he goes to see a Revolutionary War monument in Connecticut, and he sees that 2 Black soldiers' names have been segregated from the list of the white soldiers that had fallen. And for him, this represented yet again another instance of why African Americans should not participate in the American Civil War. He gravitated towards, or he continued to write as he developed his political theories, and still tried to advocate for African Americans by different means. And in 1863, as he's advocating against African American participation, he's completing The Black Man, His Antecedents, His Genius, and His Achievements. And as he's writing this text, this is a text, it's a collection of biographies of famous African Americans, as well as other Americans around the Black Atlantic. He recognizes in this text, as he recreates these biographies, the power of liberation within a historian's pen. In other words, the power of the historian to rewrite the past so that people will appreciate the present in a new way. So he begins to write this. He completes it. He publishes his first edition of it in 1863. So right as Black enlistment comes to the fore. as he's writing this, he comes in particular in contact with the idea of war and the power of war to reestablish Black people's participation and their capacity to contribute to freedom and establish their freedom in the Atlantic world. In particular, for instance, he looks at Toussaint Louverture, who was the leader of the Haitian Revolution, one of the biographies he includes in his 53 accounts in The Black Man. And he really starts to see the power of military service. He starts to appreciate the power of history to uplift. And by 1863, even as the text is coming out and he had been advocating against participation, he begins to see that Black participation in this great civil war might prove to be the difference between further exclusion and the ultimate inclusion of African Americans within the United States. So his activism takes a dramatic turn in 1863. He begins to enlist African Americans. He enlists in places including New Bedford, Massachusetts. If you've looked at the collection of letters on the altar of freedom, you'll recall in that text that the great moments where Black soldiers are being incorporated in. And that text began with a speech delivered by William Wells Brown at New Bedford, where he's starting to really encourage young Black men to join the Union Army and to contribute to the fight for citizenship and for manhood as they struggle to end slavery. Now, his activism joins that of Douglass, who had been advocating for Black enlistment since before the Emancipation Proclamation. It joined that of William Cooper Nell, who, like Douglass, had been advocating for Black enlistment. And now William Wells Brown is advocating for Black enlistment as well. Now, as the war picks up, Douglass, Nell, and Brown are already starting to think about what happens if the Union wins. And in a recruiting speech that Douglass gives, he echoes to the future. He talks about the future history that he hopes to be written, that he anticipates to be written. And here you have a quotation of him referring to that. He said, "When history shall record the names of heroes and martyrs of the Civil War," he's speaking, "let it not be said that in the long list of glory there appears the name of no colored man." So Douglass, Nell, and Brown are already starting to think about how the past is going to be reflected in future histories. Brown also begins to think about such things. He writes a new edition of The Black Man in 1865. So in addition to stories of Frederick Douglass, who he includes in The Black Man, in addition to stories of Toussaint Louverture, who he includes in The Black Man, he also starts to include soldiers of the 54th Massachusetts, and he begins to add evidence of the Civil War. Now, in these accounts, he begins to advocate for the three major accomplishments that Black people were seeking, in addition to freedom itself, which is the redemption of manhood, the attainment of self-respect, and ultimately the creation of citizenship. Now, ultimately, the recruitment of Black soldiers and the participation of Black soldiers had dramatic costs. 37,000 Black soldiers died, and 2,894 specifically perished in battles. So, of course, you have this dramatic death that follows these enlistments, and it's always worth noting. But for Black leaders like Nell, like Douglass, and like Brown, there were still many battles to be fought as the war came to a close in 1865. Would those deaths be remembered, they asked? What would Black people's part in the U.S. look like after abolition? Would African Americans be citizens? Would they be able to vote? So as they fought, and as many people now think about them as achieving manhood, as establishing freedom, as attaining self-respect, all in the way of establishing citizenship, there were these questions. Because, of course, remember, lingering in Nell's mind, in Douglass's mind, and in Brown's mind is what happened to the American revolutionaries, Crispus Attucks, Peter Salem, and those of the War of 1812. They had been forgotten, and Black people had not been given the opportunity to participate in the American polity. So this leads to recollections in the post-war period. Now, memories, of course, had great political power. There are numerous texts. Remembering the Civil War by Caroline Janey really gets into this. Civil War Memories by Robert Cook starts to really develop these. So I won't go into too much detail on these. But in these texts, they really outline 5 important reasons that memories became so important in the wake of the American Civil War. First of all, there was a market for the war narratives, and authors always looking for audiences to buy their books were willing to write them. Many soldiers desired public validation and vindication, especially on the Confederates' part, proving that even though they lost, they had been fighting for a good cause, of course, what we now call the lost cause. There was also the need to commemorate the soldiers who had died. That pre-war Civil War commemoration of soldiers communicated itself in the post-war period, with many Americans wanting to ensure that they spoke fondly of those who they lost. There's also, of course, the need to prove wartime loyalty so that one might establish in political arenas the opportunity to gain pensions. And there's also inter-party conflict fueled by the war-born enmities, of course, raising that bloody shirt literally during the post-war period to say who earns and deserves political power. And during this period, you also have the status of veterans taking on new meaning. And there's several books talking about the transformation of what it means to be a veteran. But it's enough for me to say that in the post-war period, because there was so much dramatic transformation of the body politic, because so many people had died in the war or who had lost limbs in the war, that many veterans had to re-articulate what it meant to be a veteran, distinct from the previous wars. That many are advocating as themselves as being distinct from those previous spaces and contributing to the remembrance as veterans. And finally, as this political power of memory takes hold, 4 important remembrance strains develop. So there's the lost cause, there's the Union cause, there's the emancipation cause, and finally the reconciliation cause. And of course, the lost cause is the Confederates' point of view. The Union cause is those who advocate that the Union was foremost in their minds, and they were always fighting for that. The emancipation cause is the one that Douglass really took hold of, and David Blight so ably demonstrates in Race and Reunion. And then the reconciliation cause is one that tries to draw both sides together and is one that really takes hold in the early 20th century and lasts arguably up to today. But African Americans choose to participate in this emancipation cause and really start to push it towards the forefront. And these memory warriors include most notably Frederick Douglass, who has this vision of Black soldiers, which I have quoted at several times to demonstrate the importance. But now he really wants to hold on to that vision of Black soldiers. And he sees memory, in particular, the emancipationist memory, as a means of fighting for this. And what he's trying to say is that the Civil War was primarily about fighting for the cause of the enslaved peoples, and that emancipation was the great achievement of the American Civil War, and Black soldiers were crucial participants in this fight. Now, Frederick Douglass, of course, is known as the great orator. His oratory has been documented recently. They have on HBO the 5 great speeches of Frederick Douglass. I teach Frederick Douglass's speeches. Last week, we were just looking at his 4th of July celebration speech. So Frederick Douglass is known as the great orator. He's, of course, also a great writer, but he concentrates in the memory wars on the spoken word, not the written word. Now, William Wells Brown brings that written word that had been so critical in the pre-war period and that now really transformed with historical accounts into the post-war period. And in 1867, he publishes The Negro and the War of the Rebellion. And he says in this that he is anxious to preserve for the future reference an account of the part which the Negro took in suppressing the slaveholders' rebellion. So here you see clearly William Wells Brown using the written word and this new version of American nationalism, this inclusive American nationalism that is anti-slavery, to say that Black soldiers recreated the nation. And in particular, to do this, he tells the stories of Black valor. Of course, he recounts the 54th Massachusetts, the famous regiment, even in its own time, the one that he had helped recruit for in New Bedford and across New England, and of course, the one that we all know so well thanks to glory. He also tells, and I think the most poignant moment, the story of, quote, the poor slave boy Sam, an enslaved man who worked on a Union naval vessel, who during a grisly firefight lost his legs. And when he was passing up shells, he finally just yells out, "Don't worry about me," basically saying, "I'm already going to die. Just let me continue to fight." And for this, it really shows this black badge of courage. So just as we had with the red badge of courage, where Henry wanted that badge of courage to demonstrate his participation in the fight, you have William Wells Brown showing enslaved men wanting to show their participation in the fight. So as you can see here in Thomas Nast's political cartoon, they can advocate for their place in the American polity. Now, the Memory Wars are not, they don't end, of course, in 1867. They're an ongoing battle. And the next major contributor to the written word, who I'll conclude with today, is Frances Roland. Now, Frances Roland had been born free in South Carolina, an African-American woman who attended during the American Civil War the Institute for Colored Youth in Philadelphia. And because she was not able to participate as a soldier, perhaps she would have, she ended up teaching in South Carolina. She returned once the Union took hold in portions of it. She taught in a Freedmen's Bureau school and then the Lewis Tappan Night School. So she early on shows her contribution to the Union war effort in her own specific way. Shortly after the war, on a vessel called the Pilot Boy, she bought a first-class ticket, and she was denied access because she was Black. She ultimately sued and won. The captain of the Pilot Boy was fined, and she won vindication in the court. And during her fight, she ended up meeting Martin Robinson Delaney, who becomes an important contributor to the development of her own historical activism. So Delaney, who you see pictured here, was an abolitionist. He became a major late in the war, one of the most high-ranking Black soldiers during the Civil War. He served in the 104th U.S. Colored Troops. Of course, there's this famous meeting he has with Abraham Lincoln, where Lincoln writes a note to Stanton in support of Delaney becoming an officer. But Delaney had a peculiar run-up, much like William Wells Brown, to his participation in the American Civil War. He did not start off as a strong advocate of this inclusionary activism. He was more on the side of emigration, believing that African Americans should isolate themselves from white Americans and advocate on their own behalf, uplifting themselves. So as he meets her, as he meets Roland, Roland is participating as she can as a Black woman in Civil War politics. Now, Black women, of course, like Black men, were marginalized politically. Yet, of course, there's also the double bind because women are isolated as women. The emphasis on war to secure male citizenship among Black men meant that women were even further marginalized because they couldn't become citizens as Black men were advocating for Black military service. So they were barred from service. They did their part in their own way. You had Sojourner Truth advocating for recruitment in Michigan. They were also served as washerwomen. They served menial tasks in Union hospitals. They served as teachers. Susie King Taylor was a teacher for the 3rd South Carolina Colored Infantry. And of course, Roland also participated in this vein, helping to educate free people as they had escaped slavery and give them the written word. Now, after she meets Delaney, she combines her advocacy for African Americans with the need to advocate in the post-war period for Black citizenship when Martin Delaney asks for her to write his biography. Now, Roland's activism comes together after she agrees, after Delaney offers her a stipend to move to Boston and write the text of Martin Delaney's life. And she planned to use history of Black soldiers to fight for inclusion. And as she did so, she was going to fight the gender limitations on political participation by moving into the realm of historical writers, authors. At the time, men were primarily the ones who were able to write histories. She even had to struggle to get a book contract, publishing under the name Frank. But she chose to contribute her voice in this way, combining her pre-war activism and her post-war activism. While researching in Boston, she rubbed shoulders with prominent abolitionists, Henry Wentworth Higginson, of course, a leader, colonel in the South Carolina Regiment. You had William Lloyd Garrison, the famous abolitionist, but she also spent time with Nell and William Wells Brown. She discussed with them history as she advocated and thought about Martin Delaney's history. And she agreed with William Cooper Nell's and William Wells Brown's patriotism, but she remained skeptical. Writing in her diary on Washington's birthday, "I am no enthusiast over patriotic celebrations, as I am counted out of the body politic." So she has this patriotism, but it's skeptical. And this makes its way into her account of Martin Delaney. In 1868, she publishes The Life and Public Services of Martin Delaney, which is the next major contribution to this Black Badge of Courage. She used Delaney as the model of the Black soldier, even though he had only served a short time in the 104th U.S. Colored Infantry and had not seen combat. She chose him to be the model. She also, in this text, responded to a revival of racism in the post-war period. Because during the Reconstruction era, slavery, of course, had been eliminated finally by the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. Now you have scientists creating new racial ideas to say, even if Black people are free and can contribute equally to the nation, they are less capable of participating because they are less intelligent, as many white scientists advocated. So what Roland did was she just responded directly to these accounts, combining the pre-war history writing, the pre-war nationalism, and her advocacy as a woman in the space that she could to reaffirm Black patriotism, counter anti-Black racism, and stress, more than anything else, that Delaney was of pure African heritage. Her last chapter advocated for Black people as Black people because they were entirely Black people, confronting those who said that Black soldiers were only capable soldiers because they were part white. And she says, in this quotation I'll read for you, "Nature marked him for combat and victory." She uses this scientific language to prove to Americans that Black people and all peoples of African descent were deeply committed to the nation, and that they were by their very nature as capable of combat and of victory as white Americans. So with this, she was able to respond directly to anti-Black racism, right as white Americans were using it to fight against the, citizenship and the development of suffrage in the post-war period. Now, as I alluded to in just a moment ago, and in conclusion, I'll say, the battle for memory, of course, continued. The successes of Brown and Roland helped cement Black soldiers. It established this Black Badge of Courage, and it gave us textual accounts of the past that had survived. And they were able to survive despite white historians' interest in the early 20th century to forget Black contributions, which is, I think, epitomized in a quotation that's included in W.E.B. Du Bois's Black Reconstruction from a U.S. Grant biographer, which was, "American Negroes are the only people in the history of the world that ever became free without any effort of their own." So you see here how this forgetfulness reared its head again in the 20th century. You had, of course, the Birth of a Nation, which depicted Black soldiers as being despicable. So this forgetfulness and this denigration of African Americans and Black soldiers specifically occurred again in the 20th century. But the textual accounts, the Black Badge of Courage, helped sustain Black memories, this emancipationist vision of the war, into the post-civil rights era when white historians and Black historians were able to redeem Black soldiers, most notably in the text that introduced me to African American soldiers, which was McPherson's The Negro Civil War, which is, of course, a collection of sources that were expertly contextualized and included William Wells Brown's text on Black soldiers. And of course, this all led up to glory. Right, so the final, perhaps the the most potent example of the Black Badge of Courage in America today is the story of Glory. And in thanks in part to the historians who collected all the sacrifices Black soldiers made and put them on paper, preserve them for us to know today. And with that, I'll close.